Cruise lines are getting much stricter with families in 2026. If you've cruised with kids before, a lot of these rules will sound familiar. But what's changed isn't the rules themselves. It's how seriously cruise lines are now enforcing them. Things that were once handled with a quiet reminder or a warning are now escalating much faster. And in some cases, families are facing fines, written notices, or even being denied boarding altogether. This isn't about cruise lines becoming anti-family. In fact, family cruising is still hugely important to them. But as ships get busier and guest expectations rise, rules around behavior, supervision, and safety are no longer being applied loosely. In this video, I'll walk you through the real ways cruise lines are getting stricter with families in 2026, from kids' club rules and curfews to cabin supervision and boarding requirements, so you can avoid surprises that could turn an amazing family holiday into a stressful one. If you're cruising with children this year or next, this is one of those videos that's far better to watch before you pack. Number 1. Kids being kids is no longer a defense. One of the biggest changes families are noticing in 2026 isn't a new rule, it's a change in attitude. For years, many cruise lines were quite relaxed when it came to minor behavior issues involving children. Running in hallways, loud play in public areas, or minor disruptions were often brushed off with a warning or a friendly reminder. That tolerance is fading. Cruise lines are now far more focused on consistency. Rules that apply to adults are being applied to children as well, and parents are being expected to step in earlier rather than later. When crew receive repeated complaints, the response is no longer, "They're just kids." It's a formal intervention. This doesn't mean families are unwelcome. It means cruise lines are prioritizing safety, liability, and the experience of all guests on board. Behavior that disrupts shared spaces is now more likely to be documented and escalated. The key change for families is this. What used to result in a quiet word may now result in a written warning. And once something is logged, future incidents are taken much more seriously. Understanding that shift early can prevent small issues from turning into much bigger problems later in the cruise. Number 2. Pool decks and public areas are being monitored more closely. Pool decks have always had rules, but in 2026, they're being enforced far more consistently, especially when it comes to children. Running, rough play, jumping between loungers, or treating shared areas like a playground are now much more likely to draw immediate intervention from crew. What used to be handled informally is now being addressed earlier, often before other guests even complain. Cruise lines say this comes down to safety. Pool decks are one of the highest risk areas on a ship, with slippery surfaces, hot tubs, and a mix of adults and children in close quarters. Even minor incidents can lead to serious injuries. There's also a guest experience factor. On busy sailings, pool areas fill quickly, and repeated disruptions affect everyone using the space. Crew are now expected to step in sooner to keep things calm and orderly. For families, the main change is visibility. Behavior that might have gone unnoticed before is now far more likely to be seen, addressed, and remembered. Keeping an eye on how children behave in these shared spaces can prevent small moments from becoming formal issues later on. Number 3. Noise complaints involving families now escalate much faster. Noise rules on cruise ships haven't changed, but how they're enforced has. In the past, noise complaints involving families were often handled informally. A quick knock on the door, a polite reminder, and things usually ended there. In 2026, cruise lines are taking a more structured approach. Repeated noise complaints, whether it's loud play in cabins, children running and shouting in hallways, or late-night noise, are now more likely to be logged formally. Once a complaint is documented, future issues are treated as part of a pattern rather than a one-off. This is especially noticeable on ships with more premium pricing, longer itineraries, or a higher number of adult-only spaces nearby. Other guests are less tolerant, and crew are expected to act sooner to prevent ongoing disruption. For families, the key difference is speed. What used to take several warnings can now escalate after 1 or 2 complaints. And once something is recorded against a booking, it tends to follow the family for the rest of the cruise. It's not about punishing families, it's about reducing repeated disturbances. But the practical outcome is that parents are now being expected to manage noise earlier and more actively than before. Number 4. Group behavior involving kids is far less tolerated. One quiet but noticeable shift is how cruise lines are responding to groups of children moving around the ship together. Large family groups or packs of kids running between cabins, stairwells, and public areas used to be a common sight and often ignored unless something went wrong. In 2026, that kind of behavior is being treated much more seriously. When groups of children block hallways, dominate shared spaces, shout, chant, or treat the ship like a playground, crew are now stepping in earlier. What cruise lines are trying to prevent is escalation, accidents, complaints, or situations where other guests feel uncomfortable. This has become even more of a focus with the rise of social media, where group behavior is sometimes encouraged for fun, challenges, or filming. Cruise lines are making it clear that shared spaces are not free-for-all zones, even on family-friendly ships. In some cases, families have been asked to keep children separated, return to cabins, or restrict movement during busy periods. If behavior continues, it can be escalated as disruptive conduct. The important thing for parents to understand is that scale matters. One child being noisy is handled differently from a group creating ongoing disruption. Cruise lines are now drawing that line much more clearly than they used to. Number 5. Kids Club rules are no longer flexible. Kids clubs remain one of the biggest reasons families choose to cruise. But in 2026, cruise lines are enforcing kids club rules much more strictly than before. Age cutoffs are now applied exactly as written. There's far less flexibility around children being almost old enough, and staff are no longer able to make informal exceptions. Sign-in and sign-out procedures are also being followed much more closely, including who is authorized to collect a child and at what times. Pickup times matter more too. Late collections are now being documented, and repeated issues can result in temporary restrictions on kids' club access. This isn't about being difficult. It's about staffing ratios, safety requirements, and liability. For parents, the main change is predictability. What the rules say is what will be enforced. Understanding those boundaries ahead of time can prevent awkward moments or disappointment once you're on board. Number 6. Leaving children alone in cabins is treated as a serious violation. This is one of the biggest "I didn't realize" that changes for many families. Cruise lines are now taking a very firm stance on children being left alone in cabins, even briefly, and even if the child is asleep. What some parents see as a quick trip to get food or attend an activity is now considered a safety risk. When children are found alone, crew may involve security, and the incident can be formally recorded. In some cases, families have received written warnings, and repeated incidents can escalate to more serious consequences. Cruise lines point to emergency situations as the reason for this approach. Fire alarms, medical issues, or evacuations require immediate adult supervision, and unattended children create serious risk in those moments. The key shift here is enforcement. This rule has always existed, but it's now being applied consistently. For families, that means planning around supervision at all times, even when it feels inconvenient. Number 7. Unescorted minor curfews are now actively enforced. Curfews for unescorted minors have existed on many cruise lines for years, but in 2026, they are being enforced far more consistently and with clearer consequences. On many ships, children and teenagers under a certain age are no longer allowed to be in public areas late at night unless they are accompanied by an adult. What's changed is that crew are now actively checking rather than simply assuming supervision. When unescorted minors are found breaking curfew, it's no longer handled casually. Families are receiving written notices, and repeat incidents are escalating much faster than before. In some reported cases, fines have been issued, and families have been warned that continued breaches could lead to forced disembarkation at their own expense. Cruise lines say this is about safety, particularly in late-night environments where alcohol is present and staffing levels are lower. It's also about consistency. The same rules now apply regardless of how old a child looks or how well-behaved they seem. For parents of teens, this has been one of the biggest surprises. Behavior that may have been ignored on previous cruises is now being addressed directly. Knowing your ship's specific curfew rules before sailing has become far more important than it used to be. Number 8. Behavior tracking and booking notes now apply to families. One of the least visible changes, but one of the most important, is that behavior tracking now applies to families in the same way it applies to all guests. When incidents occur, whether it's repeated noise complaints, curfew breaches, or disruptive behavior involving children, those events can be logged against the booking. What many families don't realize is that these notes can influence how future issues are handled during the same cruise. Once a pattern is established, cruise lines are far less likely to issue informal warnings. Responses become more structured, and escalation happens more quickly. In some cases, additional privileges may be restricted, or security may become more involved. Cruise lines say this isn't about targeting families, it's about consistency and fairness. As ships get fuller and guest expectations rise, behavior management is becoming more formal across the board. For families, the takeaway is simple but important. Small issues that happen repeatedly can add up. Understanding that behavior is now documented helps parents address problems early before they turn into something much bigger. Number 9. Health and medical disclosures for children are being taken more seriously. Health checks and medical questionnaires have always been part of cruising, but in 2026, cruise lines are paying much closer attention to how these are completed, especially when it comes to children. Undeclared symptoms, recent illnesses, or incomplete health information are now more likely to be questioned at the terminal. If a child shows signs of a contagious illness, families can be delayed for further screening, denied boarding, or placed under onboard monitoring or isolation. Cruise lines say this is about protecting everyone on board. Ships operate in close quarters, and even minor illnesses can spread quickly, particularly among children. Post-pandemic policies have made lines far more cautious about outbreaks. What's changed is the tolerance level. In the past, mild symptoms might have been overlooked. Now, families are being asked more detailed questions, and inconsistencies between paperwork and a child's condition can raise red flags. For parents, honesty matters more than ever. Trying to push through a mild illness can result in much bigger problems than delaying a cruise. Being prepared for extra screening and knowing that children are subject to the same health rules as adults is now part of cruising with a family. Number 10. Family cabin occupancy rules can now get you denied boarding. This is one of the most serious ways families are being caught out in 2026 because it can stop a cruise before it even begins. Cruise lines are now enforcing cabin occupancy limits far more strictly at check-in. Every passenger, including children and infants, counts toward the maximum number allowed in a cabin. What's changed is that these limits are now being verified carefully at the terminal. Families who arrive with more people than their booked cabin allows, even unintentionally, can be denied boarding on the spot. In many cases, this happens without compensation because the booking itself doesn't meet safety or evacuation requirements. This issue often arises when families assume that young children don't count, when last-minute changes aren't updated correctly, or when cabins are booked without fully understanding occupancy restrictions. Cruise lines say this is about safety and compliance with maritime regulations, particularly evacuation planning. But for families, the outcome is simple and devastating. The cruise ends before it begins. Before sailing, it's now essential to double-check that your cabin category, ship layout, and passenger count all match exactly. This is one rule that offers no flexibility once you reach the terminal.